Waiting to 5 after and we'll get started. So thank you guys for all joining us. I appreciate that. The premise behind this particular call is during our first revamped Chiefs Advisory Team, many of you had concerns and or questions regarding the multi-jurisdictional task force agreement that James Westbury put together and had a lot of feedback regards to that. I wanted to get everybody together to be able to provide that feedback and ask some questions and have James provide his point of view before we kind of move on to educating people. So, Natalie, do you have anything else you want to add before we begin?
No, sir, that was a good introduction. I think letting everybody know what James is and does would be great, and that's that.
James, you want to take the floor and introduce yourself and give them all your great accolades and awards that you've won?
I don't know about awards, maybe a few cases. I'm a lawyer, have represented GRMA cities and employees in GRMA over the last almost 20 years in different kinds of litigation. And hang on, I'm getting kind of a weird echo out of there where it's coming through my screen. I've done a lot of work on police liability claims and insurance coverage matters over the years, and we've had these claims come up involving multi-jurisdictional task forces. We had a pretty widely known injury a few years ago with the kid up in North Georgia that got hurt with the flashbang grenade that was thrown into a house on a no-knock warrant, and that gained national attention, was a huge GRMA claim, had a few GRMA cities involved and some counties. That same multi-jurisdictional task force had a shooting claim around the same, period of time, a few years anyway, that ended up having the ACCG IRMA program have to kick in policy limits for about 3 counties where a couple of the guys shot a pastor who they thought was a drug dealer. And over time, we've had these drug task force cases come up, and what's happened is you've kind of got the guys who are involved in the task force, and what we've seen in some of these instances is nobody's really in control, and a lot of it's just the Wild West. And from the standpoint of a defense attorney, you're looking at what's almost like an ultra hazardous activity that's very useful, but has the potential to create significant liability for the cities and counties involved. So a couple of years ago, we started working with Athens Clark to develop a prototype agreement using their multi-jurisdictional task force as kind of the guinea pig to work with them, because it was a pretty good, sophisticated task force. We put together an agreement, and what we wanted to make sure was that there was unified command and control, that you knew who was in control, whose policies govern, which agency was ultimately the one in control who could, decide when people had to go from the task force. It required everybody who was involved to have insurance coverage. It specified that nobody's employees were agents of the other participants in the task force. And basically, it was designed to cover some of those issues that we felt like you needed to cover in an agreement like this. And as we went through this process, we looked at all the intergovernmental agreements for these task forces around the state, and most of them looked different. Very few of them looked like they were actually drafted by attorneys, and they didn't cover some of the basic things that you needed to cover such as having insurance coverage for people who are involved in the task force. So that was kind of the backdrop, and we put together the agreement for Athens, and then we went back even after that and refined it some more. And I believe the one you've got up on the screen is the final product that we came up with. It's certainly not perfect, but I would be interested to hear what kind of feedback we can get from the people who've looked at it and chosen to either use or not use it.
Do you want to just, I don't know if there's different sections you want to talk about within this agreement? Anything specific you want to highlight, James?
I can walk you through it. You've got the agreement up there on the screen.
I do.
I've got it on my screen too. The first part of the agreement there is just what we call the recital clause. It sets out the factual backdrop for the agreement, and the code section there that's referenced is a code section in the title that governs cities and counties that, you know, we had to put this somewhere, and mutual aid agreements are authorized by the Georgia Code. And the rest of that is just factual, you know, material. If you go to page 2, it defines who the lead agency is going to be for the task force and makes that agency the one whose policies are basically going to control, unless you set up separate policies for the task force. And the issue here is you don't want to have people from different agencies who are, let's say you've got a high-speed pursuit, and the people in the task force need to, you know, participate in that. You got to know whose policies are going to govern that, so that, you know, because pursuit is one of those areas where all the agencies may have completely different policies, but you've got to have some policy that's going to govern the conduct of anything this task force engages in. So we wanted to have a unified command structure and unified policies. We had a advisory board who would give, you know, the participants in the task force the ability to have input into the policies of the agency and so forth, and we set out that framework. And all of this was, you know, originally there was I think ACC put together an original prototype agreement, and we took that and tried to take some case law that was out there and improve on that. So this is not just stuff we came up with. We worked with ACC to develop this too. On page 5 is the part where it sets out the operational command and control and makes the lead agency, the agency that's in charge in terms of command and control, and the chief of police of the lead agency will designate who the commander of the drug task force is.
Not yet. Keep going.
If you go on to page 7, it gives space where the agencies can be identified, and it designates how many sworn and civilian personnel that each of the agencies is going to designate, because the agencies still keep their employees on, you know, as their W-2 employees, but they dedicate those resources to the task force. And we needed to set out what each agency was responsible for in terms of committing resources. The agency, the task force itself doesn't, you know, it's not a legal entity. It doesn't have title to property. So you need somewhere in this to designate, you know, that the human resources are going to be committed by the agencies involved, and then the physical resources too, in terms of equipment and vehicles and things like that. So we tried to, you know, delineate that in the agreement. On the bottom of page 9 is the section that talks about the federal JAG grant funds that come in, and the lead agency is the fiscal agency that's responsible for handling those funds, and it designates how much of the funding comes from those funds and how much of it is from local agencies to match. And any of this could be changed to, you know, basically be customized to any particular drug task force, depending on the needs of that unit. On page 13, we set out the requirements for insurance. Everybody has to have insurance on any of their personnel that's assigned to the drug task force. We also have some pretty typical language in there when you have a collaborative arrangement to make clear that, my employees are not your employees and aren't agents of you for any purpose. So everybody's responsible for basically their own employees, and it doesn't create a partnership or a joint venture kind of arrangement that could create imputed liability for the participants in the task force. Everybody is required to have workers' comp coverage for their employees. They've got to have general and law enforcement liability coverage, automobile liability coverage, all the insurance coverages that you would want to have with something like this.
Hey, James?
Yes.
Before we move on to that, back on page 14, number 4, where you've got the recitals in there about I'm not responsible for your employees, you're not responsible for mine, etc. What do you do? How does that relate to if the lead agency is appointing the drug task force commander and he's in fact the decision maker in the field and at least in some kind of quasi policy making role? How does that, it seems like that would contradict the purpose of doing it. You see what I'm saying?
Well, that's a good question. It's a very good question. The lead agency in any of these situations is going to be a little bit of a lightning rod. And that's the best way I can put that, because if you're, designating the commander and you're out there, controlling what this task force does, we can put in this agreement that nobody is responsible for the acts or omissions, but of other people's employees. The law may or may not respect that. We're just trying to do what we can to have unified command and control so that you operationally can limit, the potential for injuries or damage to property. But anybody, the agency, the lead agency, whether you have this agreement or not, if you're designating the commander and you're the one whose policies are being used, you're going to be a lightning rod. I'm representing the city of McDonough right now in a case where they designate the commander for the Henry County Drug Task Force, and we've got a situation where a couple of officers who were, arrested somebody, had nothing to do with the task force, and the commander was not on scene, wasn't involved with the arrest, had nothing to do with it, but their commander is a defendant in the case, and the city is a defendant in the case simply because, he's the commander of the unit. I feel like we'll be able to get the city out and get him out, but that's just part of being the lead agency. You're gonna end up being the target or one of the targets for any kind of litigation that comes up. Does that answer your question?
I noticed when I went through I'm not trying to hijack your going through the document, but I better get it out before I forget. As I was going through it, the structure of it varies. The different entities throughout the state that participate in these task forces vary so much that, obviously each one would have to be customized. But in particular, what was crossing my mind as we were going through it about whose policies control one thing or another. And obviously, the more entities you have involved in one, the more complicated it gets. But, we're in Spalding County, we're just getting outside the metro area, and we have this weird mix of agencies that, like Griffin is CALEA accredited and state certified, and we've got policies and procedures out the wazoo, but our cohorts in the county don't have any of it. So when, I guess, for a practical matter, when you're trying to decide who's the controlling entity and whose policies you're going to use, it becomes quite complicated as to everybody's not the same, even though they might be participating in the same initiative. I suppose when you get to Athens, Clarke, and Cobb County and some of those some of the more metro counties, everybody's pretty much on a level playing field, but you might have a sheriff's department in one city of some size, and then a couple of really small ones and I wouldn't even know where to begin to check to see what their liability insurance coverage looks like.
That's a good. It's a really good point, and I'm down here in Griffin with you. I think Griffin's a good example. McDonough's a good example, and Griffin's CALIA certified, and you've got a lot of policies for a lot of different things. I think at a minimum, and this is the case regardless of the size of the jurisdiction involved, at least the high risk policies. I mean, use of force, pursuits, things like that are going to be the areas that are going to create the most liability. Everybody who's involved in the task force, if they're going to be involved, should really be up on what those high risk because pursuit is a good example. That's one of the things where somebody is just going to get hurt if you engage in a pursuit, either the suspect or some member of the public. And
this way I was thinking about it was, as opposed to saying we will adopt the lead agency's policy, is to let the controlling board actually establish a separate policy for the drug task force that is based on the critical areas that need to be covered. But that's just kind of the way I was thinking about it.
I agree with you. I think it's intended to give that flexibility where the advisory board could, adopt policies specific to the agency, so you don't have to. And any of this can be changed from one agency to the other or one task force to the other. But I think the idea is that if the advisory board needs to adopt policies that would supersede, other policies, you would have the flexibility to do that, so that you could have policies that would be appropriate for, your task force and whatever activities it was going to be involved with.
Yeah, I noticed
James,
in the
I'm sorry.
due process side of it that you had the option for people that didn't go along with the policies was to be removed from the task force, but not necessarily affect their employment status with their lead agency. So I suppose we might run into that conflict if the entity was adopting its own policies, because I can see it now when an agent or somebody got in trouble for violating the task force policies. And so, well, you can't fire me because I'm a city employee. I'm not subject to that, other than the removal from the task force. So.
Yeah, the idea is that the commander would be able to just remove them from the task force, and they would go back to their respective jurisdiction, and you'd have all the administrative policies that would apply there in terms of their rights as an employee. And part of this crosses over into this area of how the liability attaches to. We use there's a case out of Garden City where they had a multi-jurisdictional task force, and Garden City actually was able to establish, I think Chatham County is either Chatham County or City of Savannah was the lead agency, and the commander had the ability to remove them because they had the ability to remove the officer and send them back to his respective jurisdiction. It gave Garden City the ability to basically shield itself from liability in that situation, because the employee was the borrowed servant of the task force, and it actually helped the city. I think it was a GRMA claim. So there's some of that's not stuff that you can really see, and if you're not really deep in the weeds on some of the liability issues, or really a lawyer, you probably wouldn't, and most lawyers wouldn't even know that. But the idea is that it's not just a straitjacket. It should give some flexibility so that you can have specific policies that the task force adopts, but in the absence of that, whose policies you're dealing with, and but that structure where the task force commander can remove the person and send them back to their agency, That also keeps the task force from having to, have its own separate set of due process protections in place too. And I don't know if this has created issues around the, with these task forces. I haven't seen that where it's really been a problem where somebody's gotten, discharged and sent back to their original jurisdiction. But
the further out you get, the wilder it gets. That makes sense.
It does. That's kind of the issue we had with that task force up in North Georgia, because they had a couple of really bad liability claims, and some of the, like in that flashbang grenade case, I was the coverage counsel in the case, and everything I saw said you never blindly throw an incendiary device into a room. And I saw the pictures from the actual event, and if you just looked in there, there was a baby crib right across from where they threw the thing in there. And as I described it before, we're concerned that some of these things are kind of like the Wild West, because nobody's really in control, and you got a lot of guys that are jacked up driving Humvees around, and in paramilitary gear, and the optics are bad, and it just creates a lot of liability issues for the jurisdictions and their insurance carriers that are involved. And we're just trying to kind of get, this up to a better standard, so that everybody's got, unified command and control. Everybody's got insurance, and it's there's some uniformity to it around the state too, because all these things, I think there was about 14 of them, and they all look completely different.
Do you expect GRMA or ACCG to exert some influence, essentially to say, if you don't get within the parameters of one of these approved agreements, we're not going to cover you?
Stan, can you answer that?
Well, as of right now, there's certainly no intention of doing that. We want the cities to do as much as they can to reduce the liability. One of the concerns, and we tried to address it within the coverage agreement, is the stacking of limits. And certainly the attorney up in that flashbang case was threatening to stack limits. And he had, James, correct me if I'm wrong, but I mean, he had an avenue to go there. And so, we were concerned we were going to have to pay the policy limits for a number of different cities that participated in that task force. And again, we tried to change the language so that only one limit would apply, but it only really works if every city that's participating in the task force happens to get their insurance from GRMA. But to answer your original question, no, at this point, if there becomes a rash of these type of claims coming out of these task forces, then we might have to reconsider, whether or not we want to impose something, or at least strongly ask the members to adopt a specific agreement. But there's nothing in the pipeline currently where we want to go down that road. I mean, we try to let the cities do what they think is best as much as possible until it gets too expensive.
Stan, and I guess Stan and James, so is there a potential for providing, kind of separating the task force totally and providing them with their own insurance rather than having departments have their own, having requiring specific insurance for that task force?
We've reached, and that's the way it's done in some other states, and I think that most of us would agree that that would be the most proper way to do it, but I don't think there's a way to do it in Georgia. They're not necessarily their own entity.
I don't think they can, because they derive their law enforcement and arrest powers from the specific entity, the municipality or the sheriff. So I think there'd be a separation between the two.
Right. We talked about that over the last couple of legislative sessions as to whether to try to get some legislation going to set this thing up, because it would be really nice to take one of these things and put it out here as its separate entity. And, it would have its own liability and could have its own insurance, but then all the respective jurisdictions would be shielded from that. And, every time we've had the conversation about that, I just don't think we've got the political will in Georgia to do that yet, because whenever you do that, you're going to run up against the trial lawyers, and you're also getting into this area where cities and counties are kind of at odds a little bit, because counties enjoy a lot more immunity on state law claims than cities do. So it's kind of a heavy lift. And, I think what GRMA was trying to do was not really trying to, twist people's arms into having a specific agreement, but really just trying to commit some resources, because what we've seen is you've had a lot of, basically law enforcement officers, police chiefs and sheriffs and guys that are involved in these units trying to pool their resources to be able to work better, particularly out in the rural areas, and obtain some of these federal monies. And, we just haven't seen where there was really a comprehensive legal effort to put together a good agreement. And I think what GRMA was trying to do was just commit some resources to this, working with Athens Clark, trying to come up with really a resource that was available, but not really trying to strong arm anybody into having to use that particular agreement, but just giving them a resource they didn't really have at their disposal. And if you didn't have anything other than an agreement where everybody was required to have insurance, that would be a big improvement over the ones we've seen, because I don't think any of them actually require that.
Right.
And that's kind of a foregone conclusion with any kind of arrangement like this.
Well, I've written a few of these things and done them, and I especially like the language in here that actually defines the entity and stuff like that. I didn't use that before. I kind of basically had taken one of the guidelines for a federal task force and cannibalized it, and some of that would be very helpful in here.
Can you identify yourself?
Mike Yates, I'm the chief in Griffin.
Mike, thank you very much. So we kind of went through the policy and everything else. During our meeting, I guess the comment was made that we wouldn't be able to live by this particular agreement. That was one of you couldn't sign it because you wouldn't be able to live by it. And one of the things that in order to do their job to attack drug issues, you need these task force to have some impact on the drug community. So I guess, Mike, I think you've made some good comments, and feel free to chime in. But I think if Bill or Chad, I think, is on the line, if you have any comments regarding, would you be able to use this agreement? Is this something you would be able to use? And if not, why?
This is Chad up in Henry County. I know James was just talking about us up here a while ago. Our MOU is fairly close to this, I think. James, I think you read ours.
Yeah, yours is pretty comprehensive.
Yeah. But we had a DA and a Solicitor General on our board that originally was there to help us get this going. So ours is pretty close to this. I think the only thing we have our own set of policies and procedures that we do that the board approves. And James, tell me if you think this is good or not. What we have after that is if something we don't cover occurs, the agents fall back to their parent agency's policy. We don't have a controlling agency per se. We don't have, just one agency that kind of controls everything.
Right, and I think that's totally appropriate. I think you've got to have some policies that are going to govern, and if either you use the lead agencies or if the task force adopts its own policies, that's probably even better. The big thing is just so that everybody knows which policies they're going to use, and they've got some training on those policies, particularly the high risk policies. And then, there are things, this is kind of a limited purpose organization. So you don't necessarily need, a 500-page SOP like you've got at your police department or your sheriff's department. But you need to cover the stuff that you're going to be involved with, because this is a high risk, it's a high risk unit that's engaging in almost nothing but high risk activities. So you need to have one set of policies, whether they're the lead agencies or whether they're the task force policies. And this could be, modified as appropriate for each task force to address whichever way they want to do that.
Right, and that is the way we do ours. I think more or less everyone, I think except one of our agencies is state certified, which they're trying to become that. And pretty much what they do is we take our policy for the drug task force and they make that their narcotics policy for their agency, more or less. And that way we stay, within the parameters and the standards to keep state certified.
Very good. So Chad, you're with Henry County?
Yeah, with the Flint Circuit Drug Task Force, yes.
Okay.
He's the client I was referring to that's gotten sued up there who wasn't involved in that arrest.
Okay. Bill, do you have
Dan,
any
this
comment?
is Bill Westenberg. As I mentioned at the meeting, we're part of the Marietta Cops and Murder Narcotics Task Force here locally. Historically, the Sheriff's Office, District Attorney's Office, and Solicitor General's Office all have taken lead on a lot of what we've done in regards to MOU and such. They also take, the county has taken upon themselves to incur the liability. So it kind of leaves us in a good spot in that regard, although there always could be changes, as you know. The concern that I would have, and I did bring this up at the last board meeting, they were unaware of any concerns on a statewide, but they didn't have any concerns that we would be left hanging or that it would put insurance companies at risk of being sued individually or for those who participate in GRMA. However, it's naturally something that I would want to get in front of the district attorney's office and let them review to see, and of course our attorneys as well, to see if there is any liability on our regards specifically that we need to be looking at. Secondly, obviously, would be whether or not that any other jurisdiction within that group would be willing to change or look at changing in accordance with this or would see any value with it. So there may be some challenges there if they think the way of the group is better than what this proposes, and it may or may not be. Second to this is I would be curious of any other, I guess, language that could look at things beyond drug task force, because I know that there are some areas of the state that do have multi-jurisdictional task force that don't have a focus on drugs, and if there's any thoughts on that beyond just the drug task force themselves.
James, you want to answer that?
I think that's an operational question. I mean, you could have one of these agreements in this framework for any purpose you wanted. Just the ones that happen to be out there right now that we see are drug task forces, and I think part of that is because we've got the federal, grant money that the local jurisdictions can get if they set this up, and there's actually an avenue for that, but I don't know of any good reason why you couldn't have a task force for any number of different purposes, where you needed smaller jurisdictions to pool their resources to tackle whatever problem they can't tackle individually, particularly out in your rural areas.
If there's a need for that, James, do you think this particular policy could be amended to be more generic to cover other types of task forces?
Oh, absolutely, because there's nothing there's aside from the parts of this that deal with grant money and that type of thing. You could easily adapt this agreement to make it fit with any kind of joint project that law enforcement, or even it wouldn't have to be limited to law enforcement. You could get, police and fire departments, and things like that. Things like having a clear delineation of who's in control or which policies are going to control, who can discharge people from the unit, and requirement that everybody have insurance. That's stuff that's going to apply regardless of what kind of problem you're trying to take care of. So we could easily modify this, and this agreement's not perfect. I'd say it's probably 90% perfect. I would welcome input on things we can do to make it more readily usable, or things we could do to make it a better resource for jurisdictions to use.
And Natalie, Could you? I know one of the chiefs had said that they probably would not be willing to sign this particular agreement. I didn't hear any of the details. Do you? What is the feedback you've heard about any kind of negative feedback about this agreement?
I am in the same boat as you are, Stan. I know it was Scott with Athens Clark that said he couldn't sign it, and I really wasn't sure as to why. I don't know if anybody else remembers why he couldn't. I don't know if it was because of the way it was written before that he said he didn't sign it. I really don't remember.
He didn't have any, that I recall, he did not have any specifics in regards to that. And I was hoping he'd be able to join us to provide those.
Yeah, the only concerns I had with signing it are basically structural. There's nothing to do with the skeleton of the agreement. So it would be more or less the who's in charge and stuff like that, which for the purposes of us addressing the issues you talked about is not important. So, I mean, I said I couldn't sign that particular agreement, but that's just a matter of housekeeping. I don't think it has anything to do with the substance of the agreement.
Okay.
It's a tool. It can be modified. If you modify that agreement any which way you want to, it's going to be better than most of the agreements that are out there now, and certainly better than no agreement at all. So it's, it's just a resource for anybody to use, as they see fit.
I think there are other two type of task forces that are probably most common, and I did one of these out of state before as an ICAC task force, and then the gang stuff. But the gang stuff is so similar to this, that's probably more or less one and the same. The ICAC stuff is the Internet Crimes Against Children task forces, and there's a few of those sponsored by Secret Service, and the grant funding is the same. It's just out of a different arm of the government.
Well, I mean, I certainly have, and if James is willing to do it, and Dan, if you think it's something that you need as part of your bank of documents, if James wants to make some alterations to this to create a secondary form for other types of task forces, GRMS is certainly willing to pay for that service.
We can do that, and the modifications we've talked about here, we can kind of make it, we can change the language so that when you use the agreement, you can pick one or the other. Forms are sometimes drafted like that, so that we could put some language in there if you wanted the task force to adopt its own policies rather than having the lead agency's policies. But we could certainly make it more easily usable by people who wanted to have to cater it and customize it to their particular use.
Dan, do you know if there's any material differences in this particular model agreement versus what ACCG may have come up with?
I do not know. I can't speak to that. Hey, Bill.
Yes, sir.
Would you have? I mean, do you have material? Do you have any objections with the policy? I mean, is this something you think would be good for us to communicate to the rest of the state?
Yeah, I do actually. I think it would be good to look at, especially if we were able to generalize it more or have a separate, less descriptive that specifically focuses on drugs. I think the only other thought I have is gang and or major crime type arrangements. I know some of the smaller jurisdictions may rely on one another. They may work together in investigative modes, more or less. So I don't know what possibilities they have there, but getting those out as model agreements, I think, would be a very big benefit for police chiefs and for GRMA. I think that city managers and elected officials seeing this type of information and having it available so they can go back and deliver it to their city attorneys or county attorneys would be a huge benefit. So all that to say, yes.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Mike, you agree with that?
I do. I think we also might be able to get some support or encouragement from especially the Chiefs Association relative to state certification, to at least get some pluses put into the state certification model to encourage more formalized task forces. And if we had a kind of a bullet list of what we needed to make sure each of those agreements addressed, it would probably help.
Okay. Chad, thoughts?
No, I think it's very good. I think I think it goes along with some of what we're already doing, and I think it's for us in the past. It's been able to I don't want to say deflect some liability, but show some that we had some organization and we weren't. Like y'all were saying, just out there Wild Westing it, gunslinging. We actually have a rules we go by, and I think this is very similar. And I think this is a very good for to go by. Absolutely.
Very good. Natalie, you got any parting shots before we go?
No, sir. I think it's been a good meeting.
Dan, anything else?
No, just appreciate everyone's input on this. It's obviously from an insurance perspective, it's really important to have something out there that works.
James, you
Some
got
of the
any
agreements we got back decades old.
James, you got any final parting thoughts?
No, I think this is all good. I welcome the input, and I hope we can make this better. And the other thing I would add is, as we get this out there and we communicate it, I think like anything else, we need to train the people who are going to have to use it and put this in place. So I think as much information as we can get out there, the better, so we can get people using this.
Well, here's what I see as the follow-ups from this, and tell me if you disagree. One, you're going to make some changes to make at least another option a little more general option. I think we probably should talk to the Chiefs and Sheriff's Association and get their buy-in to this. I think we'd also, to Stan's point, probably talk to ACCG and see if this maybe get you to look at the ACCG version of this and make sure it's comparable to what you are doing. And then once we get all those things done, then we should do a webinar to start communicating this process. So potentially we might have, some of your participation, Mike and Chad and Bill, might be good for you guys to participate in that, to be able to just give your point of view and your, your kind of seal of approval on this process. I mean, James, I think, would provide the overview and describe the process, but would love to have your participation to help support it. So I thank you guys so very, very much for your time. I really appreciate it. I'm glad that you got to see both James and my pretty face. We're not just pretty faces. We both have opinions that are valuable too. And you guys have a great rest of the day.
Appreciate it, fellas.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks.